Welcome to the first CHASES lecture of 2025. I think most of you know what CHASES is, but for those of you that don't, this is the Center for the History of Agriculture, Science, and Environment of the South, in the South. We sponsor various visiting speakers and various other activities throughout the year. Mark Hersey over there, Dr. Hersey is the person to talk to. If you're interested, we also have a website. This talk will also be recorded and posted up there later. Today, Dr. Blum is a professor of history at Troy University, and I think we call you an environmental historian, but she has a lot of other interests as well. Her first monograph was on the Love Canal catastrophe. Her current work brings together her interest in games and gaming and game history. And I always like to point out that she has designed many games, including one about the Mississippi floods. Yeah, fascinating. Worth asking about that. Like, how do you get your head around playing a game as a historian and thinking about like inevitabilities and things like that, causality. Her current work brings together, I think, interest in children's history and perhaps also maybe game history and gender history. And today's talk is about the youth climate activism, the roots of kind of the current movement, I would say, in the outdoor and conservation education of the first half of the 20th century and messaging about citizenship and all of that. So thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you, Alex. Hi, I am so happy to be here. Thank y'all so much for having me. I certainly want to thank Mark Hersey and Alex for inviting me and everyone here at Mississippi State for inviting me to do the Chase Lecture Series. I'm just really honored to be here to do that. I am a published game designer, so if you want to ask about that stuff, I am more than happy to do that. The talk really doesn't have anything to do with games at all. This is my more academic kind of research. And it's a project that I've been working on for quite a while, the roots of modern 21st century climate activism by youth. In the early 2010s, I got really interested in what I was seeing from young people becoming very politically active and open about climate issues, and doing so in a whole variety of different ways. There were legal cases that were being filed, demonstrations in the streets, all kinds of things. One of the most visible, of course, was the Climate Strike March in 2019, and here in the United States, which was very influenced by Greta Thunberg, the Swedish teenager who had every Friday been going downtown and basically sitting in strike, leaving school and sitting in strike against her government not acting more efficiently on climate change. Thunberg influenced a lot of young people here in the United States as well, including a very energetic and prominent group of young women right here, our modern activists. From left to right, this is Haven Coleman, Alexandria Villaseñor, Isra Hirsi, and Maddie Fernandez. I want to talk specifically about Haven because she's the one who sort of got me thinking about this project that I'm going to be talking about today. Haven was 12 in 2019, and in school she had been learning about endangered animals and the threat to endangered animals and all species from climate change. Her teacher in particular had touched on sloths, the plight of the sloth, and Haven's favorite animal in the whole world was a sloth. So she became very concerned about this threat to her favorite animal, immediately goes home and begins to do some more research on climate change and wants to do something about it. She connects to these other three young women through social media. Villaseñor at the time was 13, Hersey and Fernandez were 16 at the time. But these four young women founded a national organization. They raised money, they organized, they got all the permits, and they put on this huge demonstration in 2019. Haven's story got me thinking about the role that school plays in young people's lives in how they learn about nature, how they learn about the environment, and also how that has changed over time. How has education changed as a way to inform kids about nature and climate change. So I wanted to step back and sort of understand the roots of what Haven had gone through. If you're going to be talking about the roots of what's going on now, you have to step back to the Progressive Era. So in the United States, this is the time period from about 1890 to 1920. And if we're talking about nature education in the Progressive Era, we are talking about something called nature study, which became incredibly widespread, was adopted by just about every school district in the nation. Lots of school children were participating in these activities. Very influential philosophy in the early 20th century. Nature study grew out of a very widespread concern about industrialization and urbanization. Reformers were very concerned that children were not getting enough access to nature because they were being moved into cities, and that this would cause problems for their moral development as well as their educational development. Nature study has several main tenets. The first may seem sort of obvious. Outdoor education is important to them. They want to get kids out of the classroom. But they also want to get kids out of sort of a traditional way of education. They wanted to get them away from simple memorization to more critical thinking, to learning while they are out in nature about the scientific method, to do hands-on and multisensory interdisciplinary learning. So they were interested in sort of the logical scientific part of it, but they were also very interested in children emotionally connecting to nature as well. And so nature study sort of melded these two almost conflicting kind of ideas, this very emotional connection with a logical and rational kind of aspect of it. Now, the whole aim and goal of this nature study was to produce useful citizens. And useful citizens who were interested in conservation, who could be involved in conservation and could speak up for it politically. People who would protect their natural environment. And for them, the kind of issues that we're talking about in the early 20th century that they were talking about to kids would have been conservation of forests and soil, protecting birds, protecting wildflowers, those kinds of things. The pictures that you see here, those are a lot of school gardens that got founded in the Progressive Era. And again, these were sort of to help kids learn more about nature, to be more connected and more engaged with the land as well. Okay, so Progressive Era, nature study, again, was this melding of the logical and the emotional, and the whole goal was to produce students who were interested in conservation and politics. In the wake of World War I, we see this split in nature study, and it begins to go in two separate directions, two pretty conflicting major threads. These are led by the man on the left. His name is Lloyd Sharp. And the other strand was led by a woman named Effie Bathurst. And she is a little obscure, and I don't even have a picture of her. But what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about these two people and about the two different visions they had. And I want to then conclude by giving some examples of sort of what they were doing, but also that to give sort of a message of hope for us. As educators in this time of environmental crises, this story to me has a very hopeful sort of image. If we think about as educators how we are teaching to our kids and how we can solve this climate crisis. Now, although these two people had very different visions of nature study, had very different visions of education, they have very, very similar backgrounds, which is interesting. They were both born in the late 1800s. They were born within 200 miles of each other in the Midwest. They both grew up in very rural areas. They went to high school, and then both of them decided to attend a teacher's college. They were interested in becoming educators, and then both of them moved on to Columbia Teachers College in New York, one of the most elite places to study and train teachers. After that, they began work in the education spheres, centering nature. Bathurst went to work for the federal government in the Office of Education. She published teacher guides, especially for rural teachers, about conservation education. Sharp, on the other hand, became the executive director of a group called the Fresh Air Farms, which later became Life Camps when Time Life purchased them. These were groups, if you're not familiar with them, that would take disadvantaged and poverty-stricken kids out of urban areas like New York in particular, and then they would take them to the countryside on a quote-unquote sort of vacation. And so Sharp became the director of this. Anyway, these two people have very similar backgrounds. They must have crossed paths at some point. They were at Columbia at the same time. But their views of how to educate children in post-World War II about nature were very, very different and have very different legacies. So what I want to do is I want to talk about some of these main points of difference. And I have them listed up here separately, but they're all kind of entangled together. And I want to sort of talk about how these differences affected the kids and what was going on with their education and relationship with nature as well. Okay, let me start off with Sharp. Oh, and again, I'm sorry. I'm going to be talking about their differences in their connection to nature study, what elements of nature study they decided to use or not. I'm going to talk about how they viewed history, and both of them used history to a considerable degree when they're teaching kids about nature. And then also how they viewed young people and citizenship. Okay, so let's start off with Sharp. And we'll start with talking about his connections to nature study. Now remember, nature study was outdoors, scientific and emotional, but the goal was to become better citizens. Sharp always chose the outdoor part as the most important and the element that he wanted to discuss. When he took over the Fresh Air Farms, he was extremely dismissive of how they had been operating, and he was very dismissive of sort of traditional camps which moved the city, he said, out to the country. He scoffed at camps having gymnasiums or swimming pools and thought that the kids should just, go climb a mountain or go for a hike or something. So his solution was to remove all of these kind of more traditional camp activities and to focus on what he called instead camptivities. And these camptivities, basically he went in and he eliminated all the sports, dance, theater, arts and crafts, all of that kind of thing that kids did at camp. And he had the kids learn how to put their own structures together to live in. He had them learn how to build an oven. He had them learn how to cook food, for example. So they were learning skills that helped them camp. Those were camptivities, rather than doing what Sharp thought was irrelevant and not a part of the camping experience. So he focused pretty exclusively on that. Now, fairly quickly, though, by the mid-1940s, Sharp is going to do a pretty abrupt about-face. And he's going to be developing something that becomes known as outdoor education. And outdoor education is something that's used even today in education, and it is something that became very, very popular beginning in the 1930s and 1940s. Sharp was seeking a broader audience rather than just poor and impoverished children. He was pushing for every child in public schools to have some kind of outdoor camping experience while they were in school. And to do that, he couldn't be doing the camptivities. He needed it to be a bit broader, and he needed it to have more of an educational focus. So his outdoor education had a pretty large biology component, flora and fauna kind of stuff. They would learn about identifying trees, and they would learn about plants and different birds. But it also had a social component in it. Sharp believed that by going camping and by living together, that this would lead to unity and inclusivity among the students. And he believed as well that it would diminish racism. Now, his examples tended to center on Protestant children interacting with Jewish children, and that's what he meant by diminishing racism. The camps were segregated African-American camps. There were far fewer children, far fewer resources, sort of a very similar sort of story. But he did see, he did believe that the camping experience could unify kids in that way. Okay, so that's basically his sort of connection to nature study. He wanted to keep the outdoor part, and that was the most important part to him. Now, just like his ideas shifted with nature study, where he sort of moved from captivity to this outdoor education idea, his ideas about history also changed over time. Initially, when he was working with the Fresh Air Farms, they had sort of this whitewashed sanitized kind of version of Native American history. And Sharp drew on a lot of established organizations, the Boy Scouts, the Campfire Girls, who recommended emulating Native Americans in some way. It was incredibly superficial in Sharp's case. The leaders in the different groups would be called chiefs. The boys would live in teepees. This wasn't really any kind of, thoughtful sort of incorporation of Native American culture or knowledge. So he began by emulating and incorporating ideas about Native Americans, very white ideas about Native Americans, into the curriculum. He did a fairly dramatic about-face by the mid-1930s, and he moved away from what others had been copying and shifted to promoting, doing his own thing, the white settler experience in his camping education. He was very influenced by a book called The Santa Fe Trail by a guy named Duffus. Duffus's book comes out late 1940s, and it was basically what you would think of a white man's history of Western settlement in the 1940s. White settlers are amazing and brave and resilient, and the Native Americans are evil and trying to do harm to them. Sharp was very attracted to this model. He was attracted to this model as presenting white pioneers as brave and resourceful and skilled and resilient, and that they practiced and learned democracy while they were out in the West and moving west. So for those of y'all who are familiar with Frederick Jackson Turner, very similar kind of sort of modus operandi here. Native Americans were there really only to show how brave and resilient and courageous white people were in these kind of images. Sharp believed that by teaching kids the ways and having them sort of quote-unquote play at being white settlers would help them adopt the morals and the values of those white settlers. Now, to his credit, he did understand that they were playing at being settlers, that they weren't really being settlers. Obviously, the children would never be in any real danger. They are not going to be attacked by anyone. They are not going to go hungry while they were having their camping experience, and they were able to go home at the end. But he was hoping that by living in covered wagons, that by making their own shelters and learning how to build campfires, they would learn some of the values, and some of those values would rub off on them. Now, there's a problem though, right? We're talking about the 1930s and the 1940s. We have a lot of problems environmentally, Dust Bowl, huge amounts of flooding. My game is on the Mississippi flood of 1927, and of course that happened, but there were floods in the mid-30s as well that were just devastating across the country. So there were huge environmental disasters that are happening. Conservation is playing a huge role in the federal government. Roosevelt's New Deal initiated the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. But if you're glorifying the past, if you're saying that white settlers are the utopia and they're perfect and they're brave and all of this, it becomes very difficult with this idealized version of the past to sort of understand and teach conservation, right? You can't really understand. There's this dissonance between teaching kids about modern conservation in the 30s and 40s because you sort of have to be able to understand it to be able to critique the past and see where it came from. So Sharp did not really talk about conservation. This was not an issue really for him at all. They did sort of very basic sort of biology, but his influence of these white settlers is really going to prohibit him from moving into sort of a conservation kind of ethic. Another thing as well, and again, all of these are all sort of tangled up together, but certainly Sharp talked about outdoor education and its connections to citizenship. He was a student during grad school of John Dewey. John Dewey was one of the big names in education in the United States around the turn of the century, one of the leading figures in American education during the Progressive Era, and again, Sharp was one of his students. Sharp gave lip service to Dewey's ideas. And Dewey believed and promoted the idea that education was a place to learn about democracy, where children learned how to work together and be unified and learn about democracy. Sharp gave lip service to that, but his sort of idea of learning and his discussion of citizenship wasn't maybe quite what you would expect. After World War II, He's developing his ideas about outdoor education. He began to talk about nature and outdoor education as promoting patriotism and nationalism. Having kids out in nature, he believed, would make them have a very positive view about their country. It would strengthen their connection to their historical roots. So he connected it to a positive nationalism and an uncritical kind of nationalism and patriotism. Now, in his ideas about citizenship, for Sharp, citizenship itself rested with adults, in Sharp's view. Young people were not ready for citizenship. Sharp wrote that he believed that people did not actually have the rights that were mentioned in the Constitution. They just didn't have those naturally. They had to do something to acquire those rights. And particularly for young people, he thought that they needed to be managed and trained and molded by adults in order to acquire those rights. Sharp certainly had a very negative view of young people. He thought that they were lazy and soft without adult supervision and without adult sort of prodding. He thought that they lacked a strong moral compass, and this was the purpose of some of his work, was to try to give them that. So his idea was not an idea of empowerment of kids. It was something much more top-down, adult-driven in many instances. Let me talk a little bit just about how this philosophy played out in practice with his Fresh Air Farms, briefly. Again, he's giving lip service to kids having a say in things. He's giving lip service to them having choices about what things to do. But in reality, this is not what happened. The kids were heavily monitored and observed at the Fresh Air Farms. Everything about their schedule, when they got up, when they went to sleep, what they ate, who they ate with, when they ate, their frequency of bowel movements, everything was watched and observed and recorded. Their schedule was set in detailed blocks of time, sometimes down to 15 minutes. They had no real free time at all. So this lip service that he gave, again, he's not really implementing these sort of ideas of giving them choice and some agency. So very supervisory. A lot of what Sharp was talking about too was obedience to rules, that children should learn how to be obedient to rules as a part of his outdoor education, that this was important in their development. Okay, so this is Sharp. Sharp is focusing on the outdoor part. He has a very nostalgic view of this whitewashed sort of white settler pioneer history, which led to a problem with learning conservation, and also that citizenship was something that should be left to adults, that young people needed to be and have good behavior and obedience in order for them to become better citizens. Okay, let's look at Effie Bathurst now, a very different model of what was going on. Bathurst was certainly also very connected to nature study. Her advisor was a woman named Fanny Weish Dunn. Who was at Columbia. She was a very prolific writer of manuals for teachers about implementing nature study. She wrote books for children to read themselves about nature study. So kids would learn about their habitats and what they ate and their life cycles in these books. Bathurst took Dunn's ideas and she updated them. She added elements of conservation, she added elements of ecology. She would include similar things for the kids like the birds' names and their habitats, but she would also add more conservation type lessons into what she was having kids learn. She would talk about their place within an ecosystem. She would talk about what would happen if birds were completely removed from the environment. Some of this could get a little dystopian at times, if you can see that last part of the quote. If bird populations decreased, Bathurst said, quote, "Great armies of insects would destroy the beautiful flowers, eat the food, chew up the wood and forest, and even devour the people themselves." But she did sort of tend to see a much wider kind of picture than her advisor had, certainly, and also definitely than Sharp ever did. Bathurst's main influence was in producing a lot of lesson plans and activities for teachers over about a generation. It's about 20, 25 years. She produced probably about between 20 and 30 different works where she's producing study guides for teachers, and that those were going out to help teachers, particularly in rural areas, was one of the things she was really interested in. And her idea and how she framed it was as conservation education, so with a much different focus. Her ideas about history were also incredibly different than Sharp's. Rather than glorifying the past, Bathurst had a very deep wholesale critique of past attitudes about nature, particularly by white settlers. She felt that white settlers were wasteful, destroyed the land, were disrespectful, and carried this with them as they went across the United States. She had very little nice to say about them. She certainly recognized that the things that settlers had done by over-farming, over-plowing, deforesting, was causing the current problems that the United States was facing in the 1930s and 40s. Those modern environmental disasters of the Dust Bowl and flooding, she recognized that these settlers were a part of that and wove that into her lessons. She is obviously a part of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal administration in the Office of Education there. She is very, very influenced by the Civilian Conservation Corps. She's very influenced by their very expansive view of conservation, which she adopted. Her conservation was not just about forests and soil, but it spread to humans as well. She believed that conservation was a human-centered thing. And for those of y'all who know like critiques of the modern environmental movement, that it's not human-centered enough, Bathurst was very, very human-centered. She is talking about people being healthy and being free from pollution and free from germs and all of these kinds of things way back in the 1940s. So again, she had a very wide, expansive definition of conservation, so her lessons reflected that as well. Citizenship, conservation education and citizenship. Bathurst would agree with Sharp that conservation education promoted learning about national heritage. But Bathurst, that meant something very, very different. For Bathurst, now Sharp, remember, he thought that that would mean they would learn about nature to become patriotic. For Bathurst, however, national heritage meant that people recognized their obligation to others, that they recognized their obligation to nature. In other words, she said things like, she was critical of farmers who were just out there plowing up all their land and being destructive, and she would talk about that was an example of someone who was not appreciating the national heritage. Most different with Bathurst is that she had this fundamental idea that young people should be and needed to be empowered in order to enact change themselves. She saw citizenship training and empowerment as integral. She thought that political activism was a part of what young people should experience, that they needed that kind of experience when they were young. And she encouraged teachers in many, many different ways to be a part of that, to bring their kids into political activism, to focus on local needs and concerns, get kids involved in local conservation issues. I want to talk specifically, just like I did with Sharp, but I want to talk specifically about one example in particular. And this is one of my favorites, but it's a really good example of what Bathurst was doing and promoting and sort of what she was nurturing in a lot of teachers along the way. This was a study that was done in Petersburg, West Virginia, a very, very rural area in the late 1940s. The study ran, I think, from 1946 to 1949. It was a multiple year study. The principal there was very worried about the upcoming winter because he had always had a lot of absenteeism because the kids were sick. And so he had gotten a grant and he wanted to have the kids be involved in some way. And to help with absenteeism. So he goes and talks to his teachers, and then one afternoon he wanders in and sits down with an 8th grade class, and he's talking to them. He's saying, look, we want to do a health project and involve y'all with this. The 8th graders immediately groan, as you might imagine a group of 8th graders to do, and they immediately say, oh no, we're going to have to talk about brushing our teeth. And the principal basically sort of lets them talk, and he says, well, what would y'all like to do? What do y'all see as health problems in the neighborhood? And immediately the kids begin to talk about issues that are way, way broader than what the teachers or the principal had. And their definition of health is much, much broader and wider on a community scale. The kids come up with all kinds of things. They're worried about waste in their neighborhood. They're worried about illegal dumping of trash. They're worried about trash piling up and attracting flies. They're worried about people owning livestock and not taking good care of them, and that's attracting flies and rats and all kinds of things. One of the kids is worried about pollution being spewed into the local river by one of the industries. So the kids come up with all of these really, really broad kind of ideas, and the principal, to his credit, decides to run with this. Each class, each grade in the school gets a certain project. And over this 3-year period, the kids become very, very involved in the solutions to these problems. They go out and they do research. They made these maps of where the illegal dumps were. Another grade made maps of where everybody had their, who had livestock and who didn't. They just did this huge amount of research. And the teachers got so enthusiastic about it that they began incorporating it into their other lessons. They would talk about it in math. They would talk about it, in different classes. They would have them write poems about it in English. The thing is that the kids become really involved, and they share this information with the community, and it gets the community involved, and they begin developing real solutions to some of these problems. They collect information about where garbage is picked up, and because of their investigations, the city begins to get more trucks to haul waste off. They begin to police the illegal dumping areas. They begin to do more with taking care of waste. And there are all kinds of different examples in this one little city of the kids having this huge effect on policy and really affecting their neighborhood in general. Actual policy decisions made because of these kids' activism. And this was a case, Bathurst did this for dozens and dozens of these kinds of cases. This one was really, really fleshed out, but she publicized a whole bunch of different ones and nurtured these. But she really felt that you empower kids, you have them working on real problems within their own community, and the adults in the community listened and began to feed off that and turn it into change and real policy. Now, conclusions. There's good news and bad news with the so what kind of part of this. The bad news is that Sharp's lessons won out in the short term, and in general, really. Outdoor education was a much easier way and a much more comfortable way for a lot of teachers to deal with nature study, this very top-down, control-oriented, rules-oriented kind of approach. And so we see that even in, beginning in the early to mid-late 60s, this is really what the dominant form of nature education is, what Sharp's vision was. Now, around Earth Day, about 1968 to about 1972, we have a group of new teachers who are coming up and have come up through the activism of the 60s and all of this kind of ferment of the 1960s. And some really amazing teachers begin to implement F.E. Bathurst's vision, calling it environmental education. And just these really powerful sort of agency developing kind of things where kids, again, are having some impact on what kinds of policies are being enacted in their local neighborhoods, and even on a much bigger scale. These kids are working through schools, but they're really the precursors of Haven and Alexandria and those young women. I think for me, the main so what of all of this is that it's kind of a hopeful message for educators. I think as educators, sometimes we get very pessimistic. We get very frustrated with whether or not we're having any kind of impact. But I think this kind of tells us and gives us hope, right? If you're thoughtful about how you deal with your lessons, and if you bring in real empowerment and real agency for young people, that they can affect change. And I think that's a really hopeful message for us in this time. So while we still have a lot of Sharp around, I would hope that we would start to see a lot more of Bathurst's legacy as well. So thank y'all very much. If y'all have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for this talk. I just, coming from an elementary education background, I just wanted to see how your thoughts of the standard curriculum that school teachers K through 12 have to strictly follow, and how that kind of looks at the evolution of this education, environment education.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I can speak to that really from a historical standpoint. I don't go that far up, but I think standardized curriculum has been, sort of a hindrance in allowing teachers some latitude to be able to implement these kind of really innovative kind of programs. But what we see on a smaller scale is, like if we're looking back at the 30s and 40s, we have teachers who are doing things on a smaller scale that have some of the same effects, but they're just not the giant projects like the Petersburg one. So sometimes the teachers would begin with math lessons about the environmental problem, right? Or they would be learning the math skill that they were supposed to be learning for that day, but it would be centered on the topic of whatever they were doing for the day. So, I mean, standardized curriculum, I think, can be a hindrance, but I think for creative teachers, if you're able to sort of find ways to do what you're supposed to do within that framework, I mean, I still think the possibilities are there.
I don't know if that's... Yes, thank you.
I guess thank you for your talk. I had a question just going off of that. What about, where's the connection to the development of like Future Farmers of America, FFA, an institution that's, fairly large with K through 12, right? Or even VOTEC. Where do those sort of programs maybe situate in this conversation, or is there a lot of leeway that you're seeing during the development of education?
Yeah, so I have not done a lot of work with FFA or 4-H. I've done a little bit. And they are really around in the early 20th century. I don't know if I could speak really to directly what they were doing specifically. Just haven't looked at them very much.
Yes, another related question is there a role played in this by scouting organizations?
Oh, yes. So, and there's been quite a bit of literature on the Scouts as well, Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, and then the Campfire Girls and different kinds of organizations. So Boy Scouts, I don't know how much you want me to get into this. The Boy Scouts were certainly very nature-oriented. They go through various shifts about how they're presenting nature. Initially they were like interested in chopping down trees, and then they moved into conservation. So without getting into too much detail, Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts are very, very integral in conservation learning. A lot of the academic works on this really talk about how Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts integrated gender messaging of adults with this conservation kind of message. So they're teaching manliness through conservation, or they're teaching true femininity through, environmental nature learning. So a lot of the academic work has centered on these issues of gender and nature learning as well.
I know, like, as someone who was in the Boy Scouts in like the late 90s and early 2000s, that a lot of that rhetoric is, at least at that time, was still very, very evident then. So that was surprising. Thank you for that.
Yes, sir.
Hi, thanks for your talk. That was awesome. I have a question about a shark. And I'm curious if you could go into a little more detail, if you have it, about why he switches from this pretty rigid, like, outdoor education model he has, where they're like making tents and building their own fires. Like, I just wonder what sort of factors are playing into his role to extend this to every child and push democracies. The rise of fascism he's seeing, or am I trying to draw too many?
Is that what you're seeing?
Is it like the rise of fascism in Europe and stuff that's going on that he sees as a problem?
Yes. So I think World War II had a huge influence on him, and sort of the rise of World War II. The Cold War had a big influence on him. He talks about, this is always kind of creepy to me, he talks about camping as a way to prepare for nuclear bombs, He talks about if kids can become more sufficient, they will be able to withstand a nuclear attack. So I think definitely the rise of fascism and also, the Cold War, I think have this influence on him and how he's thinking. But really earlier than that, he he was an ambitious guy, I think. And he was someone who wanted to expand this on a national scale. And he realized he was never a particularly academic guy. He majored in manual training in college. And he always said he stayed away from the heavy stuff. So he was not particularly an academic person, but I think he was able to understand that if he wanted every single school child to have a camping experience, there was going to need to be some kind of educational element in it to attract teachers and to attract grant funding and that kind of stuff. So it was kind of opportunistic, I guess. We have this ambition, this desire to spread this program, and he realized that what he had been doing was not broad enough, that he needed to incorporate and do something very different than the captivity alone.
Does he by chance make money off this? Because you just mentioned.
I mean, he doesn't become like a wealthy man, but he's head of national organizations. He gets a professorship at Southern Illinois University. He is called around the entire country to go and consult. He goes to different groups and is paid consulting fees to help them lay out their camping site for their kids and tell them what the program should be. And he starts programs for undergraduate, up-and-coming teachers, and has campsites for them. So he doesn't necessarily become a wealthy person, but he is extremely well known and very well respected and has lots of students across the country doing graduate work with him. And yeah, so.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sure.
Yes, ma'am.
This is great, thank you. I was wondering if there, in terms of, where these ideas are taken up and whether it's Sharp or Bathurst, if there's a rural-urban sort of factor in that distribution, or different sort of available natures, like in the sense of like nature in New York City versus nature in Petersburg versus nature in like a cornfield in Kansas.
Right. So Bathurst's main focus was on rural education, but her lesson plans never centered solely on that. She had activities for urban children as well, so she didn't like exclude them from this kind of stuff. She would have like, different activities that the urban kids could do. But her research sort of was always centered around more rural kind of areas. Now, that didn't necessarily mean, Petersburg wasn't big, but it also wasn't like super, super tiny. I mean, it had a fairly good population, I guess. So she was looking at a town area and town and urban issues, if they were bigger, right? Like pollution and waste pickup and that kind of stuff. Yeah. Certainly, though, there is, the very sort of common, I don't see this as much with Bathurst. I do see this with Sharp, where the city is seen as sort of an evil place, dirty. We want to get kids out of there. They're better off in the countryside kind of thing. So that urban-rural kind of stereotype, I see a lot with Sharp's work, not so much really with Bathurst. Yeah, that's all over the place. And especially in education in the 60s, there was definitely this idea of urban areas as, nasty, dirty, sordid. And you can imagine, of course, there was racial elements in there too. And
Yes.
Were these figures more emblematic of trends that you're seeing, or do they have specific, disciples going forward? I guess you may have explicitly said this and I just missed it, but I'm just curious, are you sort of taking them out of bigger trends, or are they the sort of the seed for?
Sharp is the leader of the outdoor education movement from the 40s to his death. And still today he has a pretty big, if you're in outdoor education, you probably know about Lloyd Sharp. So he is very much the center of things. Effie Bathurst is not a name that people know. she is someone that I'm using more emblematically, although she was this prolific publisher. I mean, she wrote, and they're big, thick things, these, 300-page teacher guides. But she wrote a lot about conservation education and guides for teachers over the 20 years. So I don't, people didn't know her or know her name, or she wasn't really leading organizations, but she was someone who did popularize this idea and get this idea out to ordinary everyday teachers about conservation education. So one of each, I guess. Yes, sir.
Could you push it backwards too? I'm sort of curious about the bigger context in which this is. There's all, my students know, there's always a crisis of masculinity, right?
Yes.
You're looking for one, perpetually. But are there instead of looking forward, so it's sort of Matt's question in reverse, do these people, do they have a beau ideal? Was Lloyd Sharp's beau ideal, this would be too simplistic, but was it Gifford Pinchot and hers John Muir, right? Where it's categorically feminine, caring about nature for aesthetic reasons, or for its own sake, for emotional reasons, and masculine to care about it for utilitarian reasons.
I don't know if I see that in either one of them. I mean, Sharp did from time to time. He did not emphasize the emotionality of nature, but he did talk about it from time to time, and he felt it was important. He had this article where one of the big examples was this boy who was from the city and got to see a sunrise for the first time, and this boy was just overawed by watching a sunrise. And he wrote a poem about it, and Sharp published it, and he went on and on about it. But Sharp was very much interested in Teddy Roosevelt kind of masculinity. He sort of he wrote this weird autobiography kind of thing. He refers to himself in the third person, which I always think is a little weird. But he was talking about himself growing up and this very Teddy Roosevelt kind of masculinity, which I can see in his work. But he was talking about how when he was little, he was weak and not very strong physically, and he got bullied and boys picked on him, and so he decided to take up football and track. And then he got to beat up one of the bullies that he knew. So it's this very following this Teddy Roosevelt kind of image. And he really projects this kind of idea that nature can give you that, and that being and doing things out in nature can help with these ideas of masculinity. I think you're asking me if they had influences. Is that what you're... So I would say Teddy Roosevelt, although I'm not sure if I found that explicitly, but just that storyline of how he grew up mirrors it so much. This guy, I think his name, I can't remember his first name, Duffus, the guy who wrote the Santa Fe Trail book, I think he was someone that Sharp really sort of admired, and because he wrote about him quite a bit too and was quite influential. As for Bathurst, I'm not sure. I think she was heavily influenced by one of her mentors, who was a leader at a school district in North Dakota or South Dakota. I think she was pretty influenced by him in her career choice and wanting to go into to Columbia. But I'm not sure. She was very influenced by her advisor, who was a woman. But she is not one who is exclusively talking about emotional sort of connections to nature. I mean, they're not one or the other, the two of them, if that helps answer your question. And I'm not sure I know really Bathurst's, the kind of people she was emulating particularly. But I would definitely, Sharp would be Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, I would think.
I have a very peripheral question.
Okay.
Really, and like you said that Sharp was not much of an academic, right?
Right.
But your
No.
reference to Dewey really picked up my interest, and the fact that while being lip service, right, he had a very different understanding of the relationship between education and democracy. And of course, right at the time, 40s, and there's this broader debate about how do we keep
American democracy,
Yes.
what is the best system, what is actually like the one cardinal virtue that we need to pass down to future generations, right? And like Dewey and the pragmatists and that kind of front that he might have encountered in New York, obviously during his training, was very much pit against the sort of earlier generation of like great books,
Yes.
scholars, right? And maybe even a little bit of Mortimer Adler kind of Chicago group, right? Like this idea that, well, like our democracy only survives if we pass down the particular heritage that we got in the first place. So I was wondering to what degree was, if at all, was Sharp articulate in sort of like finding or like referencing those kinds of peoples and groups, right? Like,
So in his dissertation, which was basically a description of the work that he had done as executive director for the Fresh Air Farms, he does talk about Dewey's ideas. He talks about is it Fitzpatrick. There was another guy at Columbia who he studied under. He talks about him. That's about it. He is not necessarily someone who is engaged with the theoretical kind of debates. And you know, Dewey goes out of his vocabulary after he's done with his dissertation, right? He doesn't really keep talking about it much anymore. So he's not really engaged with the sort of theoretical kind of changes that are going on in education to a great degree. He is much more interested in sort of being a popular kind of educator and you know, speaking to an everyday kind of person, I think, would be. Yeah, you're welcome. Y'all have excellent questions. No one's going to ask about the game?
And I have lots of questions about the game, but maybe we should thank you now, and then I can just ask you. All right, thank you very much.
Thank y'all.